Some significant anniversaries are solemnly commemorated. Japan's attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, for example. Others are ignored, and we can often learn valuable lessons from them about what is likely to lie ahead. There was no commemoration of the 15th anniversary of President John F. Kennedy's decision to launch the most destructive and murderous act of aggression of the post World War II period, the invasion of South Vietnam and later all of Indochina, leaving millions dead and four countries devastated, with casualties still mounting from the long term effects of drenching South Vietnam with some of the most lethal carcinogens known, undertaken to destroy ground cover and food crops. The prime target was South Vietnam. The aggression later spread to North Vietnam, then to the remote peasant society of northern Laos, and finally to rural Cambodia, which was bombed at a stunning level, equivalent to all Allied air operations in the Pacific region during World War II, including the two atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this case, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger's orders were being carried out. Anything that flies on anything that moves. Or anything that flies. Oh, yeah, that was right. Anything that flies on anything that moves. An open call for genocide that is rare in the historical record. Little of this is remembered. Most was scarcely known beyond narrow circles of activists. When the invasion was launched 50 years ago, concern was so slight that there were few efforts at justification, hardly more than the president's impassioned plea that we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. And if that conspiracy achieved its ends in Laos and Vietnam, the gates will be opened wide. Elsewhere, he warned further that the complacent, the indulgent, the soft societies are about to be swept away with the debris of history, and only the strong can possibly survive. In this case, reflecting on the failure of U.S. aggression and terror to crush Cuban independence. By the time protests began to mount half a dozen years later, the respected Vietnam specialist and military historian Bernard Fall, no dove, forecast that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction as the countrywide literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. He was again referring to South Vietnam. When the war ended, 8 horrendous years later, mainstream opinion was divided between those who described the war as a noble cause that could have been won with more dedication, and at the opposite extreme, the critics for whom it was a mistake that proved too costly. By 1977, President Carter aroused little notice when he explained that we owe Vietnam no debt because the destruction was mutual. There are important lessons in all of this for today, even apart from another reminder that only the weak and defeated are called to account for their crimes. One lesson is that to understand what is happening, we should attend not only to critical events of the real world, often dismissed from history, but also to what leaders and elite opinions believe, however tinged with fantasy. Another lesson is that alongside the flights of fancy concocted to terrify and mobilize the public, there is also geostrategic planning based on principles that are rational and stable over long periods because they are rooted in stable institutions and their concerns. I will return to that point, only stressing here that the persistent factors in state action are generally well concealed. The Iraq War is an instructive case. It was marketed to a terrified public on the usual grounds of self-defense against an awesome threat to survival. The single question George W. Bush and Tony Blair declared was whether Saddam Hussein would end his programs of developing weapons of mass destruction. When the single question received the wrong answer, government rhetoric shifted effortlessly to our yearning for democracy, and educated opinion duly followed course. Later, as the scale of the U.S. defeat in Iraq was becoming difficult to suppress, the government quietly conceded what had been clear all along. In 2007, the administration officially announced that a final settlement must grant the U.S. military bases and the right of combat operations, and must privilege U.S. investors in the country's rich energy system, demands only reluctantly abandoned in the face of Iraqi resistance, and all kept well hidden from the general population. With such lessons in mind, it is useful to look at what is highlighted in the major journals of policy and opinion. Let us keep to the most prestigious of the establishment journals, Foreign Affairs. The headline is on the cover of the November-December 2011 issue, which reads in bold face, "Is America over?" The essay motivating this headline calls for a retrenchment in the humanitarian missions abroad that are consuming the country's wealth, so as to arrest the American decline that is a major theme of international affairs discourse, usually accompanied by the corollary that power is shifting to the east, to China and maybe India. The two opening commentaries are on Israel-Palestine. The first, by two high Israeli officials, is entitled "The Problem is Palestinian Rejectionism." It asserts that the conflict cannot be resolved because Palestinians refuse to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Thereby conforming to standard diplomatic practice, states are recognized, but not privileged sectors within them. The demand for Palestinian recognition is hardly more than a new device to deter the threat of a political settlement that would undermine Israel's expansionist goals. The opposing position, defended by an American professor, is encapsulated by its heading, "The Problem is the Occupation." The subtitle of the article is "How the Occupation is Destroying the Nation." Which nation? Israel, of course. The paired articles appear on the cover under the headline, "Israel Under Siege." The January-February 2012 issue features yet another call to bomb Iran before it's too late. Warning of the dangers of deterrence, the author suggests that skeptics of military action fail to appreciate the true danger that nuclear-armed Iran would pose to U.S. interests in the Middle East and beyond. And their grim forecasts assume that the cure would be worse than the disease. That is, that the consequences of a U.S. assault on Iran would be as bad as or worse than those of Iran achieving its nuclear ambitions. But that is a faulty assumption. The truth is that a military strike intended to destroy Iran's nuclear program, if managed carefully, could spare the region and the world a very real threat and dramatically improve the long-term national security of the United States. Others argue that the cost would be too high, and at the extreme, some even point out that such an attack would violate international law, as does the stand of the moderates, who regularly deliver threats of violence in violation of the UN Charter. Let us review these dominant concerns in turn. American decline is real, though the apocalyptic version of it reflects the familiar ruling class perception that anything short of total control amounts to total disaster. Despite the piteous laments, the United States remains the world's dominant power by a large margin, with no competitor in sight, and not only in the military dimension, in which, of course, the United States reigns supreme. China and India have recorded rapid growth, but remain very poor countries with enormous internal problems not faced by the West. China is the world's most manufacturing center, but largely as an assembly plant for the advanced industrial powers of its periphery and for Western multinationals. That's likely to change over time. Manufacturing regularly provides the basis for innovation, often even breakthroughs, as is now sometimes happening in China. One example that has impressed Western specialists is China's taking over of the growing global solar panel market, not on the basis of a cheap labor, but by coordinated planning and increasingly innovation. But the problems China faces are serious. Some are demographic, as reviewed in Science, the leading U.S. science weekly. Its study shows that mortality sharply decreased in China during the Maoist years, mainly a result of economic development and improvements in education and health services, especially the public hygiene movement that resulted in a sharp drop in mortality from infectious diseases. But this progress ended with the initiation of capitalist reforms 30 years ago, and the death rate has since increased. Furthermore, China's recent economic growth has relied substantially on a demographic bonus, a very large working age population. But the window for harvesting this bonus may close soon, with a profound impact on development. Excess cheap labor supply, which is one of the major factors driving China's economic miracle, will no longer be available. Demography is only one of many serious problems ahead, and for India, the problems are even more severe. Not all prominent voices foresee American decline. Among international media, there is none more serious and responsible than the Financial Times. It recently devoted a full page to the optimistic expectation that new technology for extracting North American fossil fuels might allow the United States to become energy independent, hence retaining its global hegemony for a century. There is no mention of the kind of world the United States will rule over in the happy event, but not for lack of evidence. At about the same time, the International Energy Agency reported that with rapidly increasing carbon emissions from fossil fuel use, the limit of safety with regard to climate change will be reached by 2017 if the world continues on its present course. The door is closing. The IEA's chief economist said, and very soon it will be closed forever. Shortly before that, the U.S. Department of Energy reported its annual carbon dioxide emissions figures, which jumped by the biggest amount on record to a level higher than the worst-case scenario anticipated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That came as no surprise to many scientists, including the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's program on climate change, which for years has warned that the IPCC's predictions are too conservative. Some critics of the IPCC predictions receive virtually no public attention, unlike the fringe climate change denialists who are supported by the corporate sector, along with huge propaganda campaigns that have driven many Americans off the international spectrum in their dismissal of the threats of climate change. Business support also translates directly into political power. Denialism is part of the catechism that must be intoned by Republican candidates in the farcical election campaigns now endlessly underway, and in Congress, denialists are powerful enough to abort even efforts to inquire into the effects of global warming, let alone do anything serious about it. In brief, American decline can perhaps be stemmed if we abandon hope for decent survival, a prospect that is all too real given the balance of forces in the world. Putting such unpleasant thoughts aside, a close look at American decline shows that China indeed plays a large role in it, as has been true for the last 60 years. The decline that now elicits such concern is not a recent phenomenon. It traces back to the end of World War II, when the United States had half the world's wealth and incomparable security and global reach. Planners were naturally well aware of the enormous disparity of power and intended to keep it that way. The basic viewpoint was outlined with admirable frankness in a major state paper of 1948. The author was one of the architects of the New World Order of the day, the chair of the State Department's policy planning staff, respected statesman and scholar George Kennan, a moderate dove within the planning spectrum. He observed that the central policy goal of the United States should be to maintain the position of disparity that separated our enormous wealth from the poverty of others. To achieve that goal, he advised, we should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, and must deal in straight power concepts and not be hampered by idealistic slogans about altruism and world benefaction. Kennan was referring specifically to the situation in Asia, but his observations can be generalized, with exceptions to participants in the US-run global system. It was well understood, however, that the idealistic slogans were to be displayed prominently when addressing others, including the intellectual classes, who were expected to promulgate them. The plans that Kennan helped formulate and implement took for granted that the United States would control the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, the former British Empire, and as much of Eurasia as possible, crucially its commercial and industrial centers. These were not unrealistic objectives, given the distribution of power at that moment, but decline set in at once. In 1949, China declared independence, resulting in the United States in bitter recriminations and conflict over who was responsible for that loss. The tacit assumption was that the United States owed China by right, along with among the rest of the world, much as post-war planners assumed. The loss of China was the first significant step in America's decline. It had major policy consequences. One was the immediate decision to support France's effort to reconquer its former colony of Indochina so that it too would not be lost. Indochina itself was not a major concern, despite claims made by President Eisenhower and others about its rich resources. Rather, the concern was the domino theory. Others ridiculed when dominoes don't fall. It remains a leading principle of policy because it is quite rational. To adopt Henry Kissinger's version, a region that falls out of U.S. control can become a virus that will spread contagion, including others to follow the same path. In the case of Vietnam, the concerns was that the virus of independent development might infect Indonesia, which really does have rich resources. And that might lead Japan, the super domino, as it was called by the prominent Asian historian John Dower, to accommodate to an independent Asia, becoming its technological industrial center in a system that would escape the reach of U.S. power. That would have meant, in effect, that the United States had lost the Pacific phase That would have meant, in effect, that the United States had lost the Pacific phase of World War II, fought to prevent Japan's attempt to establish such a new order in Asia. The way to deal with such a problem is clear. destroy the virus, and inoculate those who might be infected. In the case of Vietnam, the rational choice was to destroy any hope of successful independent development and impose brutal dictatorships in the surrounding regions. Those tasks were successfully carried out, though history has its own cunning, and something similar to what was feared has nonetheless since been developing in East Asia, much to Washington's dismay. The most important victory of the Indochina Wars was in 1965, when a US-backed military coup in Indonesia, led by General Suharto, carried out massive crimes that were compared by the CIA to those of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. The staggering mass slaughter, as the New York Times described it, was reported accurately across the mainstream and with unrestrained euphoria. It was a gleam of light in Asia, as the noted liberal commentator James Reston wrote in the Times. The coup ended the threat of democracy by demolishing the mass-based political party of the poor, established a dictatorship that went on to compile one of the worst human rights records in the world, and threw the riches of the country open to Western investors. Small wonder that after many other horrors, including the near genocidal invasion of East Timor, Suharto was welcomed by the Clinton administration in '95 as our kind of guy. Years after the great events of '65, Kennedy Johnson National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy reflected that it would have been wise to end the Vietnam War at that time with the virus virtually destroyed and the primary dominoes solidly in place, buttressed by other US-backed dictatorships throughout the region. Similar procedures have been routinely followed elsewhere. Kissinger was referring specifically to the threat of socialist democracy in Chile, a threat ended on the first 9/11 with the vicious dictatorship of General Pinochet subsequently imposed on the country. Viruses have aroused deep concern elsewhere as well, including the Middle East, where the threat of secular nationalism has often concerned British and US planners, inducing them to support radical Islamic fundamentalism to counter it. See, the fucking US is a bunch of fucking terrorists supporting terrorists our fucking self. You know what I'm saying? How much longer is this chapter?